everyone. I'm Mark Fox, CEO of NetEvents, and delighted to welcome you along to this session today on hot trends for 2022. Chairing today's session is Scott Raynovich, founder and principal analyst at Futuriom. And Scott has a great panel lineup here, visionary VCs and CEOs, as you can see. So we have folks from Anjuna, Arrcus, DNX Ventures, NetFoundry, and VMware. The main areas we'll be covering in these hot trends will be developments in multi-cloud networking, cybersecurity, and then AI and other innovations in the industry. So I'd love to hand over to Scott to introduce the session today. Scott, over to you.
Great, thanks, Mark. Happy to join in yet another NetEvents, which I've been doing for many years. As everybody knows, it's an exciting, there's a lot of exciting stuff going in the cloud technology. So I'm going to give a presentation on the trends that we see here at Futuriom. Futuriom's a boutique technology research firm. I'll introduce all our elite panelists at that point. So, here's a quick overview of the trends that we see. And again, we take this research from our end user research and our company interviews. We're constantly interviewing people implementing the technology. We also do 4 or 5 end user surveys a year, exclusively in the cloud infrastructure markets. And so this was compiled from all the trends that we see from our end user research. So first of all, there's some macro trends, the business trends that are driving cloud investment that we all know about. But here are some of the things I expect to gain momentum this year. Multi-cloud and hybrid, you're going to hear more about this. There were some quite large cloud failures in the second half of 2021. Including AWS, which went down a couple times, and Google, and I think some services such as like DoorDash and Uber were down for as much as 6 hours. So you're going to hear about more about people diversifying their cloud providers, kind of have a backup plan. You're going to hear more about the edge. They're going to talk about 5G deployment and putting real-time intelligence closer to the customer. Of course, we hear about cybersecurity every day. We have some good cybersecurity experts on this panel. We can talk about how we're going to secure the cloud better. And then, of course, everybody's talking about digital transformation. That means for many people implementing, more nimble, agile applications, which can be delivered with the cloud. So, underneath those kind of macro drivers, we have specific technology trends. Here's some that we're watching closely this year. Multi-cloud networking. When I talk about multi-cloud and hybrid, well, connecting clouds isn't really that easy, and it's the network that's got to do it. And networks weren't originally built to handle multiple clouds. So you're going to see, more emerging solutions in multi-cloud networking, as well as network as a service. Cybersecurity is always evolving and getting smarter, trying to keep up with the bad guys. We're tracking what we call unified cloud security models. These include buckets such as zero trust, which embeds intelligence into the applications themselves, so they can make sure the people talking to the applications are the right people or things. We have an emerging area called confidential cloud, which we're going to hear from some of our panelists about. How do you create a secure enclave on the cloud side to protect not just data at rest and data in motion, but data in use, with hardware security. And then, of course, you've probably heard about SASE. This is like securing and integrating the edge at the enterprise edge. And then, of course, there's horizontal technologies such as AI, which enable many different applications. So we'll talk a little bit about that moving forward. So first trend, like I said, multi-cloud, hybrid, and networking. Why is networking key? Well, we need to be able to connect these clouds with software agility. We also need to integrate that with existing enterprise networking technology. Like I said, cloud lock-in concerns are growing. People don't want to be trapped in one cloud. They want to be able to move their data and applications around. And, there's been a kind of a long movement towards more open solutions and open networking. And this is still in strong demand from the end users that we see. This just shows, some of the data we collect, and there is a strong desire from the end users to integrate their enterprise data centers with the cloud provider networks. And that's actually quite hard with the networking technology we have today. Another trend we see that I talked about was unified cloud cybersecurity. These kind of new models or paradigms, SASE, zero trust, and confidential cloud. I talked about confidential cloud, which I think is new, and it's going to be an interesting new area. We have Ayal and Anjuna in that area that talk about it today, but creating a secure enclave in the cloud to protect data that's being processed. Talked about SASE, integrating these cloud security tools at the edge, and zero trust, implicit security at the app level for cloud applications. And here's a quick overview of those three new paradigms I talked about. The common thing here being is that we need to build security in implicitly, so that people don't have to be constantly plugging in tools and siphoning through alerts to manually connect security tools. We have to build platforms that provide the security automatically, and that's what some of these new paradigms for security do. At the edge with SASE, in the cloud apps with zero trust, and in the cloud processes at the hardware level with confidential cloud in execution environments. Here's another area we're watching, really innovation and AI at the edge. Like I said, AI is a horizontal technology, but it's especially important at the edge because, as we talked about, part of the edge is bringing processing power and AI closer to the customer, whether that's automated factories or self-driving cars or retail and business analytics. That's kind of the movement at the edge. Of course, 5G and edge build out is happening, as I'll explain real quickly. And digital transformation efforts are driving this need for more edge processing and connectivity. So that's our third trend. And we'll talk about other trends that might come out of that. But let's take a look at the next slide. Here's one reason why we think that's happening. There's, at least in the United States, and to a certain extent in Europe, there's investment in new infrastructure. At the United States, we got this federal level stimulus package, which allocates at least $100 billion towards new investment. That's going to include fiber and 5G for undercovered areas. And as we can see in this slide from Jefferies, they're calling it the best capital investment period in communications since 2001. That might scare some of us who are around for the telecommunications bubble in 2000, but we're hoping it's going to go better this time. This new infrastructure is going to create all sorts of opportunities at the edge, especially the far edge. So this slide kind of shows you what we mean when we talk about the edge. These new infrastructure points of access, whether it's a small cell site or a vehicle or a micro data center or a factory controller. There's going to be new avenues for them to connect and connect to the cloud, connect to AI, bring processing and applications further out to customers wherever they are. So there's been a little bit of frustration at how slowly the edge is developing, but as I think I showed with this new investment wave, it's coming. It's just coming not as fast as everybody expected, but these applications are going to emerge because throughout the history of communications, we've shown if you provide bandwidth and new capabilities, people develop the apps. In the last wave, we had things like Instagram, right, that we didn't know were going to happen, but we're going to see these new apps at the edge. I'll talk about some of these apps. We have below in some of the indices we follow in the financial markets, the Internet of Things index, some of these ARC next generation autonomous technology and robotics. You can see over 5 years, triple-digit growth in investment in these areas. There's a lot of excitement about it, especially things like factory automation and autonomous vehicles. We had at CES, I thought it was interesting that John Deere announced a fully autonomous tractor, so agricultural applications for autonomous vehicles and connectivity and telemetry. All these things connect to the cloud, right? We have some more examples here, like healthcare monitoring. So while sometimes people express frustration, there's not enough happening. I think this slide shows you that things are happening. You just have to dig a little deeper. So this is from CB Insights, a financial research firm that tracks investments. You can see they have their AI 100. This is just to show how many AI companies there are, how much investment there is. And again, AI is quite a horizontal technology. It has many applications in many different industries across the stack. So certainly will be an enabling technology for many of the things, including some of the things that our panelists will talk about today. Okay, let's move on and let's get the party started with our experts. As Mark said earlier, everybody, if you could introduce yourself very briefly, 30 seconds or less, and then we can get on to our topics that we're going to break up into those buckets of trends that I saw. So let's start with Ayal.
Hey everyone, and thanks, Scott. So my name is Ayal Yogev. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Anjuna. And essentially what we do is we, leveraging the confidential cloud, we help organizations move any application, even the most sensitive ones, to the cloud.
Hey, thanks, Scott. This is Shekar, Ayyar. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon or evening, wherever you are. So I'm the CEO of Arrcus Networks, and Arrcus is essentially a hyperscale networking platform, software-driven, and enables us to deliver routing and switching from core to the edge in a policy-driven software format. Very pertinent to many of the discussions that we will be having today, and so look forward to participating in this panel.
Hi everyone, this is Maeda from DNX Ventures. I'm one of the managing partners here. We manage about roughly 500 million plus under management, and we go after early startups globally, US, Japan, Israel, some parts of Europe. And cybersecurity is one of them. Cloud is another sector that we strongly go after. Fintech, SaaS applications. So this is what we do every day, and very much looking forward to today's discussion. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, folks. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Galeal Zino, founder and CEO of NetFoundry. We focus on the world that Scott just described, massively distributed, very fast world that left secure networking in the dust. We've reinvented secure networking to better fit this hyper-connected world.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I lead research and innovation in the office of the CTO of VMware. We're kind of in the thick of a lot of these things, whether it's cloud, end user computing, mobility, security. So definitely looking forward to today's conversation.
Excellent. Well, let's get on with it, shall we? And I encourage everybody to be opinionated and tell us your real world findings. That makes it interesting. So my first bucket that I talked about was cloud networking, specifically as it applies to multi-cloud and hybrid and network as a service, but feel free to add anything else you think is relevant to multi-cloud or hybrid cloud. I'm going to start with Shekar because, as he said, Arrcus is very focused on this problem. So, Shekar, tell us your view on what's happening here in multi-cloud networking.
Great, thanks, Scott. So I look at this akin to describing it in the form of a Big Bang theory. So for most of you who know the Big Bang theory, is kind of when the cosmos was created. Everything was started from some gigantic mass that just blew out and distributed itself and then cooled down as it became the universe around us. So I see kind of three bangs, if you will, defining this. One is what is happening in the cloud world. So we're certainly seeing giant hyperscale clouds now start getting fragmented and distributed out. The second, I would say, is in this sort of comms and 5G environment, as you see the insertion of communications technology banging heads with the compute clouds, you're now going to have a combination of these kind of compute resources that bring compute and comms together and then accessible through APIs for applications. And then the third area is really in the area of transport networking, where networks which were historically, I'd say, monolithic in their outlook are now again getting disaggregated, fragmented, and distributed. So if you put these three pieces together, this to me defines what the universe looks like for our hybrid multi-cloud existence. I think very simply speaking, Scott, I feel like the old world of single siloed architectures is really out. And we're talking about open, distributed, disaggregated infrastructures. And in particular, this then brings to light the fact that you can do things faster, you can do things kind of in a more as needed, where needed basis. And that is going to become the underpinning for all of the applications that define, broadly speaking, what many people are now starting to describe as Web 3.0, et cetera. And particularly from a networking standpoint, I think it becomes then increasingly pertinent and important to see how can you take policies, how can you define them flexibly using software on top of a choice of hardware infrastructures to then deploy across this distributed landscape. So I'm fascinated by the evolution here and just kind of encourage people to get on the boat and not stay with their siloed legacy environments, if you will.
Absolutely. And that's something we hear a lot of too. When we do our research or go to events, people say the network traditionally was pretty static for a couple decades. It didn't quite keep up with this cloud explosion. And I'm excited because it's now just starting to catch up. So we have some other good experts in multi-cloud and networking, including Galeal and Chris. So why don't I go to Galeal next? Galeal, what do you see in the momentum behind multi-cloud networking and what are the challenges?
Certainly moving closer to this distributed compute world, right, Scott, where you're running a workload where it makes sense to run near edge, far edge, cloud, multi-cloud, hybrid cloud. The exciting thing about that from my perspective is it turns secure networking into a software function, right? As these monolithic applications break down and you break them down into containers, microservices, Lambda functions, et cetera, you have to do the same thing to the network, which means you have an opportunity to orchestrate secure networking the way you orchestrate software. And that's really exciting.
Excellent. That's great. So, Chris, VMware has all sorts of technology across many of these categories. What do you see going on with multi-cloud and specifically multi-cloud networking?
Yeah, I think, well, first, it's interesting, definitely, where we're at now. I mean, just hearing, other panelists with Shekar and Galeal sharing their insights, I would say we're fully aligned in terms of the thinking, because at the end of the day, good practices are just good practices, right? What makes sense in terms of the future technology are things that are going to happen. So these things will happen. The only thing we may be able to control somewhat would be the delta, but agile programmatic networking is something that's absolutely coming in here to stay. A lot of times when I have multi-cloud conversations with other CXOs and end user organizations, the conversation is more around how do we optimize the network around some of these multi-cloud challenges we have. So that could be an application delivery controller that's fully software defined and programmatic, or extending SD-WAN out to the edge, or a SASE conversation. So sometimes when we think about multi-cloud, the tendency is to start management first, but in a lot of cases, organizations have great tools from the cloud providers themselves. So the networking challenges that they're looking to solve, essentially the security, visibility, observability of their apps and microservices, are more near and dear to their hearts and more pressing challenges that they have today. So the network plays a really key part there. In addition, I would add that we are making significant investments as well around distributed edge technologies and moving the network and also the compute platforms near the consumer of the applications. We do think that the agility around that space is going to be really important as we start to move forward, and we're starting to see some good examples of that today.
Excellent. And I know we talked about that leading up to this call, and we're in the third section. We're going to talk more about these exciting edge applications that everybody's waiting for to explode. That's great.
Just one quick note. I think we
Sure.
should make sure that we recognize multi and hybrid.
Yes.
Because we talk a lot
Tell us
about
the difference.
more than one cloud, but I do think the pendulum is swinging quite a bit to also think about what the new form of on-prem infrastructures would be and how they can get dynamically connected to multiple clouds. So I think multi-cloud and hybrid cloud, to me, feel like they could be pretty critical as we go forwards.
That's correct. That's correct. And people,
Scott, if I may jump in,
Sure.
I strongly agree with what Shekar just, mentioned. It's this, we all agree that fragmentation of architecture of, software is, becoming, all over the place. And that all over the place is just, it could be AWS, it could be Azure, it could be on-prem, and it just has to be managed in a way that is most optimizedly, makes sense for the enterprise. And one thing that led to that whole trend is that, for the last 5-10 years, whole migration of the workloads and applications to the cloud was the whole trend. And a couple of years ago, we all noticed that, Dropbox, pulling back from the cloud infra, public cloud infra, and building their own infra. And that's mainly due to the cost optimization issue, and they need to work on the gross margins. So I think that whole trend is now it's happening, the trend pendulum, pulling back. But in reality, fragmented workloads, management of those workloads in a distributed way is just so difficult in practicality. So that's why we started to see lots of innovations in the startup scene, that how to manage those distributed workloads all over the place, including on-prem and the cloud. So I think that's an exciting enablement for any enterprise and businesses who could utilize those kind of technologies to best leverage the cloud and on-prem.
That's right. That's right.
Sorry, Scott. I think Hiro nailed it there. The important part is, and we've been advocating for this internally, is to keep hybrid cloud and multi-cloud in different swim lanes, because then you can better articulate what are the problems that each product is solving, and then how do you go to market with each of those. So hybrid cloud is really about, how do I run a cloud in lots of different places, where it could be on-prem, could be in a colo, could be in a cloud provider data center. That's certainly, how we're trying to position VMware Cloud. But then when you think about the multi-cloud construct, it's different. It's how do I operate or optimize some of my AWS operations or Azure operations, et cetera. And there are different problems that you're solving for each. So if we can bifurcate the conversation, it actually, in my opinion, creates a lot of clarity in the market. It makes it easier to identify who are the vendors I should talk to, what are the products I should be looking for to solve some of these problems, because they are unique.
Excellent. Great summary, and thanks for the additional input. And we can get back to some of these topics in the third trend, but I want to jump to cybersecurity now, especially what we're calling unified cloud security. And there's this debate: is the cloud more or less secure than traditional enterprise technology? And there's kind of this explosion of cloud security technology. So I'll go to Ayal first, since he's very focused in this area, and tell us what you're seeing. Can we make the cloud more secure?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I'd say at a very high level, obviously the cloud vendors can spend more and are better security experts, I'd say, than most enterprises. So the cloud can definitely be more secure than on-prem. But the big challenge that organizations are seeing with the cloud in terms of security is sort of what the big benefit of the cloud is, also creates this huge security problem. And that is that the cloud is essentially somebody else managing your infrastructure. And by definition, if somebody is managing your infrastructure, they have access to all of your data. And this is a huge problem for many organizations. And I think, one of the ways the clouds talk about this is they talk about this shared responsibility model, where the customer has to be in charge and be responsible for securing their data, and the cloud has to share the responsibility. But most organizations, especially the large banks, I would say, don't like that shared responsibility model. They're saying it's our data, we're regulated, the clouds are not regulated, and we don't want the clouds to have any access to our data. And to some extent, this is what the clouds have been focusing on. I think 2020 was a year of basically of this huge change, where all the clouds added the concepts like confidential computing and essentially privacy in the cloud, the ability to completely isolate access from the infrastructure, from access to the data. And that now allows the clouds to go to their customers and tell them, we don't have any access to your data on top of our infrastructure, which allows customers to move more sensitive workloads to the cloud. And then the other aspect of this is that the clouds can turn to the government and tell them, you can't subpoena us to get access to our customers' data because we just don't have that access.
I mean, that's interesting. It seems like a big paradigm shift. And as we know, many enterprises are pushing back, I explained, against the lock-in. And you're talking about data lock-in, basically, right?
So this actually sort of solves that lock-in to some extent, because when you can run things in a confidential way, in a private way on top of the clouds, and because all the clouds have these concepts, you can now put different applications on different clouds, or in hybrid clouds, and have that data shared between the clouds without the clouds having access to the data. So this allows you to, we've seen a lot of people worry about, if we run things in specific countries, right? Like American companies think about, if you run things in China, or European company think, if you run things in the US, does that mean that the employees of the cloud in that country have access to the data? Does that mean that the government in that country has access to the data? And that actually drives cloud lock-in to some extent, because companies really have to trust the clouds that they're running on. If you can run things in a confidential way, this actually solves that problem. And you can then leverage, to some extent, any cloud. And if you kind of look into the future, and this is sort of a futuristic trend, if you have access compute, as a company, why not sort of sell it to companies who might need that? But security is the thing that's blocking this. You'd never run your workloads on somebody else's infrastructure unless you really trust them. But now with confidential computing, you can now do that in a secure way.
Oh, that's very cool. Rio, you're very active in cybersecurity. So, I mean, we're making a big bet on this area in this year by doing some research and reports. Are you bullish in this area, confidential cloud? Do you think the problems that Ayal talked about solving? Is that a big deal?
Yeah, like I have no questions, and I have a full agreement with Ayal. Just mentioned this in cloud management and avoiding the lock-in and the data management, data security. It's all very critical to any enterprise that's out in the world, and like regardless of geography. But one thing that I would like to paint a picture today is that we need to step back a little bit and see, and talk about like somewhat relating to the previous discussion that we had, but it's we have to acknowledge the fact that workloads, applications are just fragmented, distributed all over the place. And one thing that we really have to pay attention, like two big topics in the cyber today, is that supply chain risk and how to secure at the earliest phase of the application building. In other words, we're calling it shift left in the cybersec world. But one, first topic, the supply chain risk, if you think about 13 months ago, the world was shook with the SolarWinds things, and that was only 13 months ago. Now that I think about, but after that, like Colonial happened, and the T-Mobile was a big things in the US, and then Log4j, like lots of things happening in the cybersec even today. But supply chain risk is one of the unsolved big thing in the cyber world. And the reason that I say is like in the SolarWinds case, like hundreds of US entities, like including government, including large enterprise like Microsoft and the FireEyes, they were just, blown away like by the way that SolarWinds happened. And it was by the way of, they were all using SolarWinds applications, and it's regardless of cloud or on-prem, it's this application that they use. And it's hard to get the US government to hack into the US government and the large enterprise. But if you think about, like, if you can get into the application that's serving those governments in the large enterprise, that's the same path, the same backdoor that you could open. So the hackers from Russians were able to get into the SolarWinds scene, and they were able to get into the development environment. And that's where they embed the malicious code into their build. And that get pushed out to the government and resulted in lots of breaches. So, but when you think of it from the developer's point of view, right, they were trained to build, in the new builds and applications like at the faster and faster pace, and they had to focus on building it. And now, like, people are saying that, hey, you need to secure it as well as you build as fastest way. So this is a big new burden on their shoulder that they have to solve it, and it's a very difficult one. But the world is facing that you have to build the DevSecOps practice so that you build fast, but you need to secure it. And that this is very difficult because it used to be security was something that managed by security team, but now it's the whole budget and responsibility is shifting to the line of business that is building that application and holding that developers building it. And now they are in charge of that. So that's a big shift change, and lots of automation tools is being invented there to support those, DevSecOps practice. So that's a
great
big
points,
shift.
great points.
Yeah.
So, and we got other people deeply involved in this, such as obviously VMware and Galeal. So you guys, Chris, Galeal, you got a comment on this?
Shift left is a great phrase. We talk about it, Scott and Rio, in terms of.
I'm sorry, what was the phrase? I didn't hear.
The shift left phrase
Shift
that Rio
left.
used.
Yeah, explain that to me.
Yeah, we look at it as taking security and networking, which, as Rio said, used to be kind of on the periphery, and moving them into the heart of the development and delivery lifecycle. And I would argue, Scott, that in this world of distributed workloads that we're talking about, forget about if the workload's cloud, edge, hybrid, multi-cloud, it's going to be all over. It's a distributed workload. I would argue that world won't be secure unless we can shift left, unless we can move networking and security into the heart of the development and delivery lifecycle, because otherwise it's too late. And that's a real important difference from the world 10, 20 years ago, where networking and security could kind of be on the outside, on the periphery, day two. Not the case, I don't believe, Scott, in this kind of hyper-connected, massively distributed world we're talking about.
And is this, I mean, is this widespread, or are people actively working on this, or are we still very early days in this shift left of security?
Greenfield we see as a leading edge. Scott, at AWS reInvent, ARM and Capgemini, NetFoundry announced a partnership for autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles, which basically combined confidential compute, as we talked about earlier, with, let's just say, confidential networking. It actually, because we designed the solution from the ground up with ARM and with Capgemini, we're able in that scenario to do exactly, putting security and networking into literally the application. A little bit simpler, Scott, in that greenfield world. I'd be interested what the other panelists have to say. A little bit more difficult in a brownfield world.
I'd say the brownfield world is also exciting, and I also agree on the timelines here. I mean, our number one success metric is technology transfers. That's what I benchmark the organization on, and we look to do more than a dozen of them a year in terms of building new products and technologies that move into our businesses. And in the case of greenfield versus brownfield, I fully agree that there's some approaches we can do that are rather binary in terms of say data sovereignty and having sovereign clouds on a per region or country basis. That's something our telco business is really focused on. But then when you go a bit further, there's a lot of work around building technologies that can do inter-API communication introspection, alerting on anomalies that exist within the API itself that could be compromised. That's one area that's exciting. But then in the context of brownfield, where I think we also have to be mindful, and this could also apply to greenfield, is that through the history of IT, we tend to try to build security controls with the expectation of control. The central IT organization has full oversight. And even to Hiro's earlier points, that you're seeing this decentralization happening in the lines of business taking control. When I want to have visibility from a compliance perspective, just as one example, or an audit perspective, I also have to look at security solutions that are engineered with the expectation of chaos, that there are going to be apps and services that I don't have admin access to. They're deployed by individual lines of business. And sometimes those are sub-organizations within, say, the same edge site. But I still have to be able to maintain a security posture with the expectation that there's going to be some assets out there that I just simply don't have full awareness of. A lot of the hardware OEMs are starting to try to build more, or like the OT provider, technology providers are trying to build more interfaces into their platforms to provide a more integrated fabric. But until then, you're still going to have these pockets of isolation that you still need to be able to figure out how do you proactively manage around. And there's a lot of opportunity in that space too.
Great. Haven't heard from Shekar in a bit. Shekar, you got anything to add on this? Security
I was going to take us a bit deeper into the plumbing, which is a lot of, every time AWS goes down or something, there's always a bit of like, okay, what is at the heart of this thing? Could it be something related to configuration? Could it be related to routers? And so I do think that in terms of the whole, for a while, everybody said, oh, everything is in the cloud. I don't need to bother about anything. They'll take care of everything, right? Now we're starting to get back into the mode of saying, okay, you do really need to understand what actually happens in a BGP router at the core of your network, and how is that in fact routing the bits. What does something like segment routing do as you start adopting IPv6 protocols? And the reason I mention this is a number of us are innovating at layers that are sort of deep down, but they start surfacing themselves up into the security infrastructure simply because we're now providing a lot more programmability, a lot more access and abstractions, so that you don't actually have to be reliant on just a single environment, or for that matter, a single provider. And to me, this is actually phenomenally valuable, which is that applications can start interacting with the middle tier, which can in fact interact with the lower layers of the network, but in a way in which policies can be defined and be consistent. I mean, an example of this is network slicing as an example. In the context of 5G, there's a world out there where mobile carriers and then landline networks, et cetera, are thinking about how do you create protocols that are sliced, but then Now there's a waking up to the fact that those slices then need to get carried over into the transport network. You need your routers and switches to start adapting and then be able to securely deliver that from core to edge. So I do want people to realize that this old world of saying, oh, the public cloud will take care of everything or the hyperscaler will do everything for us is fast changing, and nothing is bringing that more to the forefront than some of the storied downtimes that we're seeing. And that is exemplary of what we need to take into control. So.
That's right. I mean, it's about control, isn't it? The people don't want to have the feeling of completely losing control, especially when the cloud is down.
So if I can just quickly comment on what Chris said and Galeal mentioned. I think what Chris was talking about was basically, and he's right in the sense of detection and identifying where the issues is. And that's sort of a never-ending sort of battle of even figuring out what assets you have in the cloud and how you can basically have visibility into what's going on, especially on the security side. And that's why I think what Galeal said and what Rio was saying is exactly right. That shift left. Security should be part of the infrastructure, should be part of everything that is being built and being deployed. And that's when you move to the world of prevention versus detection. And that's where you sort of get security by default. Security is part of the infrastructure. And to some extent, that's where security should be. Security should be a part of the infrastructure of these services.
Okay, great point. So let's take all that, and I like how this panel is so broad based, and everybody seems to have a lot larger brain than I do. But you guys know a lot about the different technologies. But what's interesting is it seems like everybody's talking about different layers of abstraction and segmentation, and how do we further abstract and segment whatever it is, that's kind of an interesting concept. So, but let's move on to the edge and AI and all these killer apps we're looking for. And I'll just kind of open this up. For me, it's about, and this keeps coming up in our edge research, I get clients or subscribers, what is the killer app, Scott, and we talked about earlier, I said there are some apps that are out there that people aren't talking about that are gaining traction and more importantly, generating revenue, which is what a lot of us want. But I'd like to hear more about, the edge and the AI and the applications you see. Let's start with Chris, because we were talking yesterday, and Chris, you were telling me about some new apps that VMware is trying to enable on the edge.
Yeah. Thanks, Scott. I think there's a few things like, I guess maybe the year of edge is kind of replacing the year of VDI, right? We don't talk about that anymore. It only took a global, right, to make the year of VDI, I guess, happen. And in the case of edge, when you say, well, what's the deal, right? Why aren't we further modernized at the edge in spite of all these talk for years and years and years? And what it really boils down to is, in many cases, it's availability of apps and services that create business value. And second, it's cost. Where we're seeing the traction start to pick up now and a lot of interest, we had announced what we call Project Santa Cruz at VMworld back in October. And what that is doing is combining an SD-WAN appliance, a physical SD-WAN appliance, with modern applications such as containers and cloud services. So you're taking, say, a retail environment, you're taking networking equipment plus 3 to 6 PC class systems, and you're consolidating that down to 1 or 2. So now you have a solution that is saving an organization costs and giving them a way to modernize. And at the same time, these devices are so simple that you literally are plugging them in. You join your mobile phone to their Wi-Fi, you enter an authorization code, and it will self-configure itself. That's the type of simplicity that organizations to move forward. And then the final part of that is you have to seed market adoption. It's not enough to have just the platforms themselves. You have to be able to provide meaningful technologies that people can adopt and use that solves their business problems. Like an example we had shown at VMworld was in partnership with Intel using the OpenVINO project. We were doing real-time inferencing at the edge in a retail scenario where we were identifying produce hitting the belt on a checkout line, as opposed to having to manually enter in codes and things of that nature.
Very cool. Yeah, and we talked about it's the the mushroom problem, right? When I go to the checkout line, they always ask, what kind of mushrooms are these? And so we could just have AI that figures out that Scott's buying the shiitake mushrooms, right?
Yeah, exactly. And what's exciting too is like the demo that we had shown, and you're seeing a lot of energy here too, is a lot of times people think if you're even doing inferencing, you need all of this horsepower. And it's really not the case. I mean, you can do fairly good intelligence and local inferencing with a small number of CPU cores. And solve a lot of real world problems at a very low cost, which is also making this technology far more accessible.
Excellent. What are any other grab bag of apps or technologies people are excited about?
Well, I think the retail edge, Scott, I would expound on that. And then I'd also talk about what's happening on the 5G edge. Retail edge, again, we have examples. In fact, at OCP, we talked about this with Target. It's clear that there is a transformation happening in the retail industry in terms of how distributed computing, artificial intelligence are going to weigh in on the giant network of stores and then get the omnichannel experience to be going in addition to how the physical locations are distributed. I think somewhat alongside this, as you think about the connectivity fabric from service providers, telecom carriers, and 5G, there is a huge infusion of now saying, how can you take what was otherwise central offices to now base stations to remote edges to cell towers, and bringing the compute and connectivity down to the level of smaller form factors at the edges and making that a useful construct for enterprises and then B2C as well to consume. So we're seeing both examples on the enterprise side as well as service provider side as we are deploying our what we call the Arrcus connected edge into those network interfaces.
Excellent. That's great. And you can see this slide just came up just as you were talking about it, or you're talking about all the different locations and where all the technology goes. You know, how do other people see this evolving? Like, is it picking up steam, or do we need to wait for more 5G towers? I still don't have 5G right here on my phone, but you know.
I think, Scott, we have a ways to go, and maybe companies like Arrcus can help us get there. I mean, just if you look at innovation generally, you need a frontier, you need a new frontier. I think clearly edge is that, and with the advances in compute, et cetera, it's a legitimate new frontier. On the other hand, you also need an environment where you can iterate and experiment, and therefore you need a certain cost, you need a certain simplicity. I'm not sure we're there yet for edge. I'm not so sure that, you know, mainstream developers can kind of tinker at the edge. I think the cost and the complexity aren't quite there. I think we've made tremendous progress. I don't have the crystal ball, Scott. Maybe this is the year that we start to make enough progress that these developers can kind of tinker and play and iterate enough that we get these kind of killer apps. But to me, that's the inflection point I'm looking at, where as a developer, the edge is simple and cheap enough that I can actually experiment and innovate.
Interesting. Ayal, I want to ask you about something we talked about yesterday. You see, we have this little brain icon and some of these things, like, and I talked about AI as kind of a horizontal technology, right? It's plugging in anywhere that we need it, but it's also being developed and provided in the cloud. But there's a big issue with these algorithms and the data and securing them. Tell us, how big is the AI security problem?
Yeah, actually AI security is a super interesting topic. I would say even in sort of just looking at sort of this moving to the edge, and looking at the slide, the more you move sort of right on the slide, the more security becomes a major issue, because the less control you have over what's going on. Obviously, if it's your own private cloud, if it's your own data center, you can just, you can lock the door, it's all your own employees, you have sort of full control of what's going on. And as you kind of move, further away, public cloud, you bring in the cloud providers and their employees, and you have third-party code running there. And as you move to the edge, you have things running sort of anywhere, and anybody can potentially gain access, and that is a huge security problem. And I think I think Galeal is absolutely right. Having sort of a cheap way of giving this to developers is one of the things that's going to make this move forward faster. But I think security is also going to be one of those sort of barriers we have to overcome. To some extent, it's almost the same. It's the same sort of solution to cloud security to some extent, where if you can completely isolate access to the infrastructure or access to the device or access to the to the hardware itself from access to the data, that allows you to solve that problem and move more and more things to the edge, and not having security become a block or a barrier for that adoption. And this is obviously true for the edge in general. This is true for AI, and sort of AI has this other sort of interesting concept, and that is you need to protect both the algorithm itself as well as the data. So it adds this sort of additional layer of complexity into things. And the other thing that security can enable here, and I always like thinking about security as sort of an enabler of things. And one sort of great example is the ability to share your credit card, online is what essentially created e-commerce, right? If every time you share your credit card online, would have been hacked, Amazon would never have existed, right? Or all these other e-commerce sites. And what security can enable here in the AI case is something called multi-party compute. And essentially that's the ability to share data between different entities without to run an algorithm on all this shared data without each entity sharing data with anybody else. And just think of the implications you have here on in healthcare, in financial services, and the ability to do underwriting, and there's just so many things that security can enable here. And I think this is going to be the next sort of big shift in what security enables.
Very cool. I'm gonna move on here, but I want everybody to give their kind of summary. This is like we're at the end of the presidential debate or whatever. You're gonna give your pitch for, like, just tell me personally what you're watching or you're most excited about this year in terms of the trends, and what's going to push us forward. Why don't we start with Rio? We'll just go across the board there.
Yeah, it's the last 5 years has been a very interesting shift in many ways, and it's very positive, right? Many applications are accessible, mobiles all over the place, cloud is there, and so things are much more efficient than ever. But at the same time, that made the whole IT environment in the enterprise so different from like 5-10 years ago. And that creates the new kinds of the how do I say, the protections and the detections, preventions, like new kind of innovation brings efficiency, but at the same time it comes with a newer problem that hasn't been solved. So it's, from the VC point of view, it's always exciting that when there's unsolved situations. So I just quite excited about whole new things that's about to happen, and this whole distributed computation is just the beginning of it. So I'm quite excited about what's happening here.
Excellent, thanks. Shekar, what do you have your eye on particularly this year?
So for us, it's been that the last decade has been all about hyperscale clouds, whereas this year and going forward, we think the action is actually going to shift to hyperscale networking, okay? Which is, as you start thinking about all of the stuff that we just talked about. I mean, we talked about cloud, we talked about security, we talked about edge. And then there is this notion of, okay, when will the applications all become real? And there is certainly a bit of a build it and they will come approach. But at the end of the day, I actually think that the most recent outages are perhaps the most pertinent ones to focus on, because it starts the wake-up call of saying you cannot just entrust the network in a single sort of monolithic format and then assume that everything is going to work. You've got to think about what scale, performance, et cetera, bring at that layer, what kind of programmability and access you have, and work that into your application infrastructure. So that, to us at Arrcus, is the most fascinating part of how deep down in the plumbing we can influence this infrastructure as it becomes real for the future.
So you're talking about what we call networking as code, that trend? Is that part of it?
Yeah, I mean, making network accessible, programmable, distributed, open, concepts that we've all talked about, but it is now becoming more and more important that people actually take control of that infrastructure rather than just entrusting it to a single cloud provider.
There you go. That plays straight into your wheelhouse, Galeal, right? I mean, tell us what you're watching this year, what you're excited about.
Yeah, no question. Actually, Ayal had an interesting phrase earlier on security as an enabler, right? Security's traditionally been a bit of an obstacle to things like velocity and agility. And I see that, Scott, the same way I saw cloud. Like, the magic of cloud wasn't where it was or where it is. The magic of cloud was that, you know, as a developer or an engineer or a business person, I could go to AWS, enter my credit card, and have access to world-class compute. Whereas 10 years before that, I would be like submitting a ticket to IT, right? So AWS and then Azure and everyone else, they've democratized compute. And as a result, innovation flourished, as we know. What we're talking about here on this panel, I believe, is democratizing security and democratizing secure networking, right? Because if we have this world of massively distributed compute, of massively distributed workloads, we have to put secure networking into the hands of the developers, move it into the heart of the development and delivery lifecycle. Then, Scott, it's democratized, right? And then they can innovate, whether it's edge or cloud or both, then they can innovate. So that's what I'm looking for. That's what I'm looking forward to. And in fact, I think it's maybe the only way we'll kind of realize these goals of distributed compute is by democratizing all the aspects, not just the compute aspect.
Excellent. I like that. Let's democratize security networking. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, so much talk on the criticality of networks. This takes me back to a couple decades ago when I was training some junior network admins and would tell them, look, if you have trouble in a support incident and you need to buy yourself some time, just blame DNS. And people always believe that, and you could move on from there, right? So I also agree that the network is important here. Other trends that I think are starting to ramp up, you know, we talked a lot about security in terms of embedding security into the infrastructure and apps, being more dynamic in terms of how we go about detection and response. But the other part too that we really haven't talked about today is recovery. I'm seeing more and more CISOs and CIOs start to talk about, hey, you know what? If we do get hit with ransomware, how can we get our apps and data back quickly? You know, what does that look like? What does the recovery side look like? And that's an important area of growth, I would say, this year as well. And the other part, just to complement what other folks have already shared on networking, is there is this intersection between the network and the developers. And this is where technologies like network service mesh are becoming increasingly important. And it's almost like if you look at like containers and say Kubernetes today, like the first wave of folks that have moved towards containers were the folks that were, in many cases, the early adopters of public cloud. So they were really on board because they were instantly able to see the flexibility provided by container-based architectures and the intrinsic benefits they had there. So they were typically the first movers there. And now we're starting to see some of those first movers on containers now moving over towards network service mesh because they're also at that point of maturity. So I think we'll start to see additional traction there as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Ayal, what's your big idea or topic for the year?
Yeah, I think the big topic this year is going to be, so what we talked about, the confidential cloud concept, and kind of more broadly, the idea of making security, you know, simple, you know, on by default and part of the infrastructure. And I think this is what's going to enable organizations to move more and more of their application. Again, the cloud is obviously happening super fast, but this is will allow them to essentially move everything to the cloud. I think, you know, there's a lot of organizations like banks, like governments, they're just now are sort of at the beginning of their cloud journey to some extent. And this is what will allow them to sort of fully jump in.
Very cool. Yeah, and I like how you explain how the security is part of the you know, avoiding the lock-in, you know, like getting control of your data back is something we hear a lot about. Yeah, just I want to thank all the panelists. I'll be using this transcript and this event to write some stuff on my thoughts and quote all the bigger brains out there. That's how I operate. I always operate by using the distributed power of the bigger brains than my brain. So, and I found that this was really informative for things for us to look for in 2022. I agree with a lot of the feedback, and it kind of meshes with what we're seeing from the consumers of technology.